Support comes from Empower Missouri's Affordable Housing Coalition, working to address the causes of housing insecurity and homelessness through tenant advocacy. Information at empowermissouri.org/housing.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Later in the show, we'll get an update on how St. Louis could spend its RAM settlement money. And we'll also dive into a new proposal to publicly fund elections in St. Louis County. But first, I want to rewind to election night inside a hotel ballroom in St. Louis. It's late in the evening, and it is abundantly clear that Donald Trump will return as president and that Missouri Republicans will dominate in statewide and legislative elections.
Tonight, we send the resounding message of where power lies.
Yet the crowd here isn't celebrating either of those things. People like Luz Henriquez of the ACLU of Missouri are expressing unbridled joy over the passage of Amendment 3, a measure that would end the state's abortion ban.
Despite the actions of our out-of-touch politicians, together, we persisted through each and every obstacle that they threw our way.
Amendment 3's victory is rekindling perhaps the most difficult question in Missouri politics. Why do voters back initiative petitions seen as progressive or left of center, while also electing Republicans up and down the ballot? To be upfront, if you're listening because you want a simple one-sentence answer, you're going to be disappointed. I can't peer into the subconscious of every Missourian who split their ticket, but I did get insight from some who did, including St. Louisan Umar Lee.
Politics is not a love affair. It is dating, a temporary marriage, and sometimes it's a one-night stand.
I've known Lee since I moved to St. Louis in the early 2010s. In 2014, Lee was in Ferguson protesting a police officer shooting and killing Michael Brown. And in between traveling around the world and sounding off on the state of boxing, Lee is a public supporter of Democrats running for municipal posts in St. Louis. This year, though, Lee ended up voting for Republicans like Governor-elect Mike Kehoe. He doesn't agree with Kehoe on some issues, especially since he also voted to legalize abortion and raise the minimum wage. But after going to an event supporting the GOP official's candidacy, he felt like he was the right person to be the state's governor.
When I look at the leadership of, or the punditry, or the thought makers and the academics that are influencing the Democratic Party, I don't see people that I feel I have a common worldview with, that I have a common lived experience with. I would, the George W. Bush line, could you sit down and drink a beer with them? I don't know if I could sit down and eat avocado toast with them, even though I would never eat avocado toast under any circumstances. But, there's a cultural divide that has emerged.
Another voter, Tim Davis, voted in a similar manner. He lives in Shelby County, which is about 160 miles northwest of St. Louis. He grew up in a family that tended to back Democratic candidates, and he doesn't think that abortion should be illegal or that the state government should crack down on labor unions. But Davis liked Kehoe's agricultural policy stances, and since agriculture is important to Davis, he joined more than 80% of Shelby County's voters in backing Kehoe.
Voters are very complex, and we have a bunch of different reasons for thinking the things that we do, and I know that even my wife and I don't agree on every single thing, and we're from the same town, and we've had some of the same experiences, but we're going to differ on a few things.
Some Democrats have been befuddled by these types of decisions, especially since people like Kehoe oppose things like abortion rights and higher minimum wages. But Kansas City resident Molly Bruns isn't really surprised by this phenomenon. Bruns grew up in Cole County, which often votes for GOP candidates, but is more receptive sometimes to left-of-center issues. For instance, residents there backed Kehoe with 71% of the vote, hardly surprising given that the governor-elect lives in Jefferson City. But 43% of Cole County residents voted yes on Amendment 3. Brunn says that many mid-Missouri voters tend to vote Republican because that's how their friends or family vote. But that doesn't mean that those people agree with the party on everything.
Something that is so core to Missourians as a whole is we hold tradition very close, especially in mid-Missouri and rural Missouri areas. With that also being said, those are an incredibly hardworking group of people. And a lot of times they don't have the time to educate themselves on what is actually going into these policies, a lot of times, what's going into these party policies.
That's Molly Bruns of Kansas City. And joining me now in studio to delve into Missouri's fascinating and contradictory voting behavior is John Hancock. Hancock is a former Republican state lawmaker from St. Louis County who has worked for several decades to help GOP candidates and to pass ballot initiatives. John, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Great to be here, Jason.
You've been involved in Missouri politics for decades. Have the voting patterns in terms of candidates and ballot initiatives always defied stereotypes or partisan patterns?
Well, they certainly have changed over the course of my career. The state's fundamentally a different place now politically, certainly from a partisan standpoint. And, whether you've had the divergent, public policy votes that take place on ballot initiatives versus the makeup of the General Assembly, I think that's fairly of recent vintage.
Yeah, and let's talk about it a little bit more than just abortion, because that's obviously getting a lot of attention now because it happened like 3 weeks ago. But Missourians have also backed legalized marijuana, Medicaid expansion, and at least 3 minimum wage increases since 2006. They've also rejected efforts to institute right to work, which bars unions and employers from requiring workers to pay dues. Why do you think that those measures in particular have been successful?
Well, I think one of the basic, most simple explanation is that the prevailing side of that has massively outspent the anti-side. And I think that's just a fundamental of American politics, that when the spending on a proposition is so disproportionate, the team that spends usually prevails. So I think that's part of it. And I also think that the state voters as a whole are less economically, fiscally conservative than they are culturally conservative.
Why do you think that no sides, opposition campaigns, for the most part, have such a difficult time raising money? Because the anti-side for the Medicaid expansion raised almost no money. The anti-side for the marijuana initiative raised very little money. And while the anti-side for the abortion initiative ended up raising some money, it was dwarfed by the pro side, which raised around or over $30 million.
Yeah, well, usually on the pro side of these things, you've got an industry or a group of people that are going to financially benefit. You look at marijuana, certainly even look at abortion. The groups that are going to financially benefit, they plow the money in. And the no side typically are folks that are concerned citizens, but there's not a moneyed interest really propelling them. The pro-life folks were able to raise, $3-4 million, but they were, outspent 10 to 1. So I think that explains a lot. But I do think the state would be inaccurate to say it's a conservative bastion of voters, because they certainly haven't voted that way on the issues you highlighted.
I spoke with Sean Sonker Nicholson, who, like you, has worked on initiative petition campaigns. And he said ballot items often have major structural advantages compared to candidates. Here is Sean explaining that further.
By the time ballot measures ever get to a voter's ballot, they are usually pretty darn popular before they get very far in the process at all. Ballot measures happen when there is a failure of normal legislative processes to produce an outcome that is in line with what voters want. And when legislators either fail in their responsibilities or choose to ignore what the voters are asking for, that's what creates the pressure and the voter support and the desire to do it. So on one hand, it's worth noting that ballot measures start as really popular ideas in general. Like it's hard enough to do. It takes enough work to do. It takes enough resources you have to raise from people and dollars and everything else that just unpopular ideas don't make it to the ballot very often.
That was Sean Sonker Nicholson, a Democratic political consultant. What do you think about Sean's comments?
Well, I think you don't go to the ballot if you think you have no chance of winning. So you're going to take an initiative, a policy position that you believe has a strong chance of passage, and then you plow a bunch of money into it, and the messaging and the polling and all of the things involved in running any campaign. And that more often than not, when one side's spending and the other side's not, the side that's spending is going to prevail.
I talked with a number of voters for this segment, including Maryland Heights resident Christopher Spears. Now, Spears was not a split ticket voter. He voted for Democratic candidates and things like the minimum wage increase and the abortion legalization measure. But he had an interesting theory about why Amendment 3 found favor this year, primarily because, in his view, voters can often connect with the issue of abortion in ways that transcend politics.
These are, very specific reasons that are very emotional. These are things that hit at the heart and not at the brain. And I think that's the kind of thing that cuts through polarization to an extent today. It's also interesting that you're seeing such narrowing margins outstate. Certainly, that it passing in St. Charles was a surprise to me, and coming close in Jeffco was also a surprise.
That was Christopher Spears, a resident of Maryland Heights who voted for Amendment 3. And what Chris was talking about there is that Amendment 3 passed in St. Charles County, and it failed in Jeffco, but it came kind of close to pass.
Yeah, right.
And given that both of those places are seen as GOP strongholds, do you think that performances like that showcase that abortion rights is maybe not as partisan as people assume?
I think that's probably right. Abortion is a unique issue. I mean, all of these other issues we've talked about, gaming, minimum wage, Medicaid expansion, those are more traditional. The abortion issue first of all, it's been with us forever, and 51 years beyond Roe v. Wade. And people have strong feelings about it, and many of those feelings are rooted in religious faith for a lot of people. And I would like to see us have a dialogue on abortion. We've not had this, but my personal belief is that between conception and live birth, I think there's a general consensus in the population that at some point that babies has rights that ought to be protected by the state. Now, we're going to have wild disagreements on what point in that line between conception and birth those protections should come into place. But that's the place where we ought to start having the conversation, societally, having the conversation, because I do think there's general consensus that baby deserves some protection. And, the whole debate we just went through with Amendment 3, we didn't have that conversation. And we can't have it now because it's in the state constitution, so the legislature can't have that conversation.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because after Amendment 3 passed, and I said abortion has been legalized in Missouri, by the time this airs, it still won't be legal, but it will be legal on December 5th. A lot of the reaction was, well, no, the legislature is just going to overturn it, but it's much harder to do that. They would have to put something else on the ballot.
Right.
And one of the people who has brought that up as a possibility is Senate President Pro Tem Cindy O'Laughlin, who believes that the debate over abortion access in Missouri is not over yet.
I think that you can value life and treasure life and feel that taking any unborn innocent child's life is wrong, while at the same time understanding that there are people who just feel this is my body and I should be able to make the final decision. So, it is a difficult topic. It isn't that I don't understand both sides. I've had 4 children. There's just no way that I could take a life.
That was incoming Senate President Pro Tem Cindy O'Laughlin, a Republican from Shelbina. On the one hand, you have abortion rights proponents saying this issue has been decided by the people, and Republicans that want to put something else on the ballot are ignoring that message. On the other hand, you hear people like Cindy O'Laughlin, who clearly have strong convictions against abortion rights, basically saying, like, there's no way we're not going to respond to this. Those are two ideas that there's no compromise there. They seem like completely in conflict.
Well, in some respects, the issue now, in light of the Dobbs decision, and, the Dobbs decision did what pro-lifers wanted it to do. I don't know that pro-lifers had effectively engaged the culture conversation over abortion well. They'd been so focused on legislating, no abortions for any reason, blah, 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 rather than trying to persuade and move and have a conversation about the issue. So I expect that we're, in some respects, back to where we were in the 1970s and 80s, where you're going to see some incremental attempts to rein in the unfettered access to abortion as birth control, for example. And I think that's going to be an ongoing issue that's going to be relevant and top of mind for years to come.
I think that one of the noticeable things that I saw in the Amendment 3 campaign on the anti-side was there wasn't much attempt to defend the law that was being repealed. There was a lot of efforts to say Amendment 3 will do this or it'll do that, but nobody that I saw was saying, yeah, I'm going to defend the fact that you can't get an abortion in Missouri if you're raped or a victim of incest.
Right.
I'm going to defend if a woman is pregnant and there's a fatal fetal abnormality and the fetus is still alive. You have to carry that baby to term. And you want to know why the reason I think there was no defense? Because those are not defensible positions to ordinary people.
They're certainly not popular positions. They're not positions that anything approximating a good chunk of the electorate supports. I mean, that's kind of where we are. The reason this issue is so controversial, in my opinion, and I've always thought this, and I ran for office as a pro-life candidate, and I am a pro-life person. But what's really happening with the abortion issue is you're taking arguably the two foundational cornerstones of the American experience, life and liberty. And in a very real sense, those two cornerstones are pitted against one another uniquely with an issue like abortion. And so the side that's defending abortion rights, they're upholding a value of liberty. It's a fundamental, foundational, cornerstone value of the republic. And I think that's where the inherent conflict exists on the issue at a philosophical level.
I'm talking with John Hancock. He is a Republican political consultant and a former state legislator back in the late 80s, early 90s.
Before we had catalytic converters, I think. It's a long time ago.
We got a lot of listener comments and questions about this phenomenon of voting for things that are perceived as liberal ballot items and Republican candidates. Coral Marina on Instagram says, where I come from, people follow local politics and the news highlight local races. Since living in Missouri, I'm impressed how little following there is on local government. How is it possible there is no local television primetime governor debate or senator debate? Most people probably consume whatever little news is in the preferred channel and flyers they get. Now, just to be clear, there was a U.S. Senate debate on Halloween when most people were trying to trick or treat with their kids. But I do think that Coral is bringing up an important point that, like, the coverage of local politics and, more importantly, people paying attention to local politics has changed dramatically in the last 30 years. What do you think about that?
No question about it. And look at the size. When I started in the legislature, the Capitol Bureau, the press corps that was physically inside the Capitol covering, you had people from the St. Joe News Press in the Capitol every day, reporters from all across the state, radio reporters from many different parts of the state. And that Capitol Press Corps, as we've all seen, has shrunk dramatically. Not to mention the number of local newspapers that go out of business every month in this country and in this state. And those are the folks that pay attention to what's happening at City Hall. I think one of the great struggles we're going to have over the course of the next few decades is with this local attention diminishing. These municipal governments, city governments, county governments are going to receive less scrutiny, and that's not good for the adequate functioning of government.
Tempest Tau Stowed on TikTok says, rural Missourian here. Candidates have an R next to them on ballots, while policies we vote for don't. Some see the R and think, that's my team, regardless. It's hard to do that with policy. Now, I heard a similar anecdote about Northeast Missouri in the 1980s and 90s. When parts of Northeast Missouri were heavily Democratic, if you told people that you were a Republican in, say, Bowling Green, Missouri, you would be like socially ostracized from your friends. Now I think it's the opposite in some parts of rural Missouri, where if you say that you're a liberal Democrat, you could be an outcast given that everybody is Republican. How does that sort of social dynamic come into play when voting specifically for candidates? Yeah, it seems really important here, and we don't talk about it very often.
It definitely comes into play. And, Missouri, in some respects, trailed the southwestern part of the United States in converting its rural areas from Democrat to Republican. That's happened now. And we're now at the cusp of a realignment of the internally within the political parties, the Republican Party becoming less of what I would call a movement conservative party, fiscally conservative, culturally conservative, and becoming much more populist in its approach, in the kind of candidates it promotes, in the kind of candidates who win primaries. And so you're going to see you're seeing shifts in the electorate right now in suburbs, moving away from republicanism to a certain extent, and then the rural areas solidifying a near, not unanimous, but certainly strong, large majority Republican voters.
Ash on TikTok says, Missourians are 3 decades into an identity crisis. They believe in many progressive ideas, but they don't want to associate with progressive people. They want to be the tough guy, bootstrap cowboy. What Ash, I think, is alluding to there is, and this is also something I've heard from both Republicans and Democrats in Northeast Missouri, the National Democratic Party is toxic to a lot of Missourians. And it is seen as much more liberal than how Missourians feel as a whole. So I've always thought national politics play a big role in state elections. How much do you think that has to do with the fact that Democrats have been struggling, especially in the last 10 or 15 years when all these ballot initiatives are passing?
Yeah, a lot of it is in the bucket of what I would call cultural issues, whether that be, gun rights and restrictions, the panoply of issues surrounding LGBTQ. There's a cultural divide in rural America with where Democrat elites are, and Democrat elites have almost ceded the high school educated working class voter to Republicans. And that was one of the defining results of this last presidential election we had. The Democratic Party, for as long as I can remember, was the party of the working class. And that change that's coming about, I think the Democrats have some real soul searching to do in terms of how they're going to present their candidates, the kind of candidates they're going to recruit, the kind of messaging they're going to implement. Because if they didn't learn a lesson in this last election, then I don't know when they're going to learn it.
Missy Grisby on TikTok says, it's ludicrous. They are voting for the people that are trying to take the rights away. It's a cycle, and they will continue to try to take the rights away. Facepalm emoji. And that kind of gets into a point that I kind of brought up when I played the Cindy O'Loughlin clip. One of the reasons why I think a lot of Democrats who follow Missouri politics are confused by this trend is eventually it could be self-defeating. If you continue to elect Republicans, they will eventually dismantle all these ballot initiatives. Now, do I think that they're going to dismantle the sports betting ballot initiative, even though it passed by a far less margin than abortion? No, because there's a lot of money to be made there. And also DraftKings and FanDuel. Mm-hmm. Was going to say Rosenbets. That was my app that I was going to create. They're going to wield a lot of power over legislators. But is that overblown though? They haven't repealed Medicaid expansion. They haven't repealed the minimum wages. They haven't repealed the minimum wage increases. They haven't repealed legal marijuana. And I'm not convinced they're going to be able to easily undo Amendment 3.
Well, they're not going to be able to repeal it. I do think that there's a lane for reasonable restrictions based around fetal viability that the voters in the state would support if it were on the ballot and done well. The voters of the state aren't going to support a law where there's no exceptions for rape or incest in the abortion law. There's not a majority.
Well, the
to
amendment
support
does
that.
cover it until fetal viability, which has a specific term, and I think that the opponents have pointed to the expanded health, life of the mother, and mental health exception to extrapolate it to saying you can get an abortion at any time. I think that legal experts strongly disagree with that argument. Obviously, judges will end up making the final call on that, but continue.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that will need to be adjudicated, obviously, because mental health is, it seems to me like that's a wide open exception, to allow abortion, but we don't know.
John Hancock is a Republican political consultant. He also is the former executive director of the Missouri Republican Party and a former Missouri House member. John, thank you for being here.
My pleasure, Jason.
When we come back, we'll get an update on how St. Louis policymakers could spend a settlement over the departure of the St. Louis Rams. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.
Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Today happens to be the 2-year anniversary of St. Louis County, and the Regional Convention and Sports Complex Authority tentatively agreeing on how to split up a settlement stemming from the departure of the St. Louis Rams. The city received the biggest share of the funds, about $280 million. And it's fair to say that both political figures and city residents let their imaginations run wild on how to spend the funds. But there are big divides on where the money should go, and joining us now to talk about those divisions is Rachel Lippmann, who covers St. Louis city government and criminal justice for St. Louis Public Radio. Rachel, welcome back to the show.
Always good to be on, Jason.
It seems that ever since news of this settlement broke around Thanksgiving 2021, there has been this never-ending conflict about how to divide or spend the money. Can you walk us through where the divide in the city of St. Louis is right now?
The divide is kind of where it has always been, which is how and where to spend this approximately $270 million that includes some interest that the money is earned. There's one plan that has already been drafted into a board bill, and that is sponsored by Pam Boyd, along with Kara Spencer, Tom Olenberg, and Laura Keyes. And this is one that is focused on north, southeast, and downtown St. Louis in areas such as infrastructure repair, beautification, streetscape enhancement, rehabbing buildings, housing, and investing in neighborhood retail. Another plan that isn't yet on paper, but will be in the coming weeks likely, will be from Board President Megan Green and Alderwoman Alicia Saunier. And this is one that is backed by Mayor Tashara Jones and is based on public input sessions that have been had from residents on how they wanted to spend this money, as well as online voting and kind of a full-blown public input process.
And just to you said 270. When I said 280, they did technically get 280, but they had to give $30 million to the board that oversees the deal.
Yeah, that was part of the deal.
Greater St. Louis Inc.'s bill would create a fund of sorts that would provide improvements to, among other places, downtown St. Louis. Why do you think there's been a push for that part of the city to see some of the money?
Downtown is the most visible area of the city to most people who come to the city of St. Louis. Yes, people may be familiar with areas like Washington Avenue, Soulard, the Zoo, the Central West End, but downtown is where you come for sports and conventions and, the thing that most people kind of go to the city for. There's also an economic element to it. You want businesses to have a reason to stay in downtown for the earnings tax reasons. There's no money that is going to solve all of those problems, but it can help when you have an extra pool of money. Think about the Railway Exchange Building or the Millennium Hotel, large vacant structures that the city wants to be able to do something with.
And I think the problem, though, comes back to one of my favorite topics, regional fragmentation. As long as St. Louis County and St. Louis are separate governmental jurisdictions, Clayton is going to be a magnet for large companies, especially because companies need to be close to county government or the courts. It doesn't really seem like a lot of money is going to solve that problem.
It's not, but the companies still have business to do with the city of St. Louis. They still have business to do with the St. Louis City courts, which are not located in Clayton. They're located in downtown. And companies do want to be in the city. There is some interest in them being in the city. There was news yesterday in the St. Louis Business Journal that a firm that was in Valley Park is now going to be locating to a building in downtown West. So you can't completely write off an interest in the city of St. Louis.
So there has been a testy war of words between Board of Aldermen President Megan Green and Greater St. Louis Inc.'s Jason Hall. Literal letters have been sent back and forth.
That is correct.
What's going on here?
Megan Green had visions for how she wanted this process of public input to go. And she wanted the bills that are going to be drafted to be based very largely on that public comment. She didn't like the fact that Greater St. Louis kind of went around her vision of that process, and at least in her telling of how this whole thing went down. What Greater St. Louis has countered with is that they did, in fact, submit their proposal for public comment, and it did get a hearing in terms of how that legislation or how the money should be spent.
I think there are other nuance that we have to talk about here is American Rescue Plan funding. So the city received around $500 million, I believe, from ARPA, and that money needs to be spent before 2026. And I get a sense there's some overlap between citizen wants and needs for the Rams money and some of the things that may already be allocated with ARPA money. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, there is definitely parallels between where the two plans would invest money from the Rams settlement and the American Rescue Plan Act. But like you mentioned, American Rescue Plan Act is a finite amount of money that has to be done by 2026. This is a chance for the spending on those projects identified for American Rescue Plan Act to be extended beyond the deadline. And it's also important to note that in both versions conceived right now of how the Rams money is going to be spent, they're not looking to output all of the money at one time. There is specific language in the current board bill that sets up trust funds for these individual areas. And Board President Megan Green has always made it clear that she will also use the money to set up an endowment for ongoing spending. So it could be continued investment from the Rams money into priority areas identified with the American Rescue Plan Act.
Now, no story about the city of St. Louis would be complete without mayoral politics playing a role in legislative proceedings.
Yeah, I know. Filing this Monday. I swore we had more of a break.
Gambling in this casino? I'm shocked. In this case, the divide over how to spend the money dovetails with 2025's mayoral election. What can you tell us about that?
This is an attempt by Kara Spencer, I think, to try and shore up some support on the north side of St. Louis. She got within about 2,300 votes of beating Tashara Jones last time around. And while I don't think she will win North Side wards if she, shows that she's willing to invest and put money into it, if she just narrows the margin a little bit and maybe picks up votes in other wards as well, she could overcome that deficit.
And I do think from a visceral level, the argument that we have all this money and we're not spending it could hit with voters who are frustrated with city services. What do you think about that?
I think it is a viable political argument to make that how is it that we have all of this American Rescue Plan Act money and this RAM settlement money, but there's always, as there is in most political arguments, nuance. There's a capacity issue here. Not all of these agencies or city departments would have the ability to spend an influx of money at one time, especially something as large as the Rams money. And it makes sense from that perspective to say, let's spend this money that has a deadline to spend now, and then we can backfill or continue to support it with these Rams money. Some of these departments, some of these agencies probably don't have the capacity or people to spend the Rams settlement in addition to the American Rescue Plan.
And quickly, when do you think the board will ultimately make a decision here?
I expect that there will be some kind of legislation available for alder people and the mayor and Kara Spencer to campaign on. They go on election break on February 7th, so I would be very shocked if something isn't in law by then.
Rachel Lippmann covers St. Louis city politics and policy, as well as criminal justice for St. Louis Public Radio. Rachel, thank you for being on today.
Always fun, Jason.
When we come back, we'll talk about our recently released plan to publicly fund campaigns in St. Louis County. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. And before we dive into our next topic of discussion, I'd like to ask for your help for Tuesday's show. We'll talk with clinical psychologist Dr. Marva Robinson about preparing mentally and emotionally for holiday gatherings. Has this election affected your relationship with a family member or friend? Have you responded to strain caused by political identity or cultural differences? Email us at talk@stlpr.org or leave us a voice message. Call our dedicated voicemail line at 314-516-6397. That's 314-516-NEWS. Now let's turn our attention to St. Louis County. If you've been following the wacky world of Missouri campaign finance, there's often a struggle between two opposing viewpoints, whether or not to limit donations directly to candidates or whether to have unlimited donations to political candidates. But a number of groups are putting forth a new option that involves publicly financing races for St. Louis County Executive, Assessor, Prosecutor, and the County Council. It's modeled after Seattle, where residents get a certain amount of money they can provide to candidates. And the goal of these so-called democracy dollars are to reduce the influence of large donors to county officials. Joining us now to explore this idea further are two people who are involved in the Honest Elections Report, University of Missouri St. Louis professor Anita Mannion, and Benjamin Singer of Show Me Integrity, a group that advocates for ethics overhauls in government. Welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Jason.
Before we get into the mechanics of the democracy dollars idea, why did you feel St. Louis County in particular needed this campaign finance overhaul?
Well, colleagues and I studied what campaign finance looked like for St. Louis City mayoral races and St. Louis County executive races from 2011 to 2021. And we found that not only is there a lot of money in those elections, but it disproportionately comes from large dollar donors and from white men and flows to white male candidates. And so our research showed that candidates who are women and people of color have a harder time raising that money. They can raise as much, and they often do, but it's a lot more small dollar donations, and they often have to go out of state to get those.
I asked because for the most part, county governmental elections often fly below the radar compared to other contests. And with the exceptions of like contested primaries for county executive in like 2014, 2018, 2020, 2022 as well, and county prosecutor in 2018, election for county council typically aren't that expensive. So what do you think about that dynamic at play?
I think that's right. I think that the county-wide races tend to have more. So over that 10-year span, there was over $18 million spent to elect county council members, which is a huge amount of money. And the majority of that came from large dollar individual donors, even more than from corporations and PACs.
Okay, so let's walk through this idea a little bit more. From reading the report, candidates for county offices can't just get into the Democracy Dollars program automatically. They would have to take a number of steps. So what are they, Benjamin?
That's right. And I want to emphasize that this process of exploring this was the result of a public input process. When we asked the people of St. Louis in surveys, what do you believe elected officials care most about? We offered three options: community interests or my interests, interests of big donors, or receiving funding for their campaigns. 87% said interests of big donors and receiving funding for campaigns. Only 13% chose the community interests or my interests. So the solution that we looked at was one of the most powerful solutions. There are multiple that are working across the country to empower regular people and decrease the corrupting influence of big money in politics. But we looked at this honest elections model in Seattle. It was created by a citizen initiative, not by politicians. And it was responding to the dominance of big money that was trying to buy politicians and seats on the Seattle City Council, especially Amazon. Every resident gets 4 $25 vouchers. That's every eligible voter.
I was going to ask, like, it's somebody who's eligible to vote, not necessarily registered to vote, correct?
That's correct. So being a citizen, being 18 or older. And it was funded, when they created it in Seattle, by the smallest tax in Seattle history. Because as much as we talk about, the disgusting nature of big money in politics, it's actually relatively small compared to, how much it costs to pick up the trash every day or things like that. And the results of of how it worked in Seattle was people-powered candidates were able to beat the Amazon-backed candidates in almost every race, although, of course, every election and every cycle is different. Low-income donors were overrepresented among Democracy Dollar donors, which closed the racial wealth gap that accounts so much for what Anita and her colleagues found in the disparity of not just how much money is flowing into St. Louis County elections, but where that money is coming from, which is what makes who our officials are paying attention to really inequitable. And so they saw more candidates running who were more diverse, and in policy they saw more affordable housing, more job training programs, more things to create inclusive growth for the region, which I know is what all St. Louisans want.
Now, one of the things that caught my attention is you could not take advantage of this program and also ask people to donate to political action committees. But let me float a scenario that I think could happen here. What would happen if, say, Sam Page decided to take part in this and his friend created a pact, raised unlimited amounts of money without his involvement? Would he then be banned from taking part of the program?
Great question. And we have seen both in Seattle and in New York and other places that have similar programs that had this legacy of corruption. Of course, New York City had one of the most corrupt political machines in American municipal history.
Tammany Hall.
That's right. So what they've seen now under the new system is, big money interests do go to outside super PACs, the local versions of super PACs, and they do spend a bunch of money. What they saw in Seattle is those big money independent expenditures are losing races. People look at the people-backed candidates and they look at who's on the side of big money, and they're voting for the people-backed candidates because the system is structured so that it's giving the participating candidates enough money to compete.
Okay, so you mentioned before that each eligible voter would get 4 $25 certificates, correct? So, I did the math a couple of days ago. I would imagine there's 700,000 eligible voters in St. Louis County. Would this cost $70 million to implement?
So not every voter even votes, although this was shown to increase voter turnout. And not every voter is going to turn in their vouchers. But what they've seen is a steady increase in people engaging and using the system. And therefore, candidates are actually reaching out to regular people and being accountable to regular people more, not having to spend 70% of their time locked in a room calling big donors, which is what politicians usually complain about having to do to get their election.
Okay, because I could see situations where there are people in St. Louis County or elsewhere who may be professionally unable to donate money to candidates. For example, I don't donate money to candidates because it is ethically wrong for me to do so. What would happen? Would they get $100 that they could spend at Schnucks or something, since they're not spending any of the money? Or would this only go to people who want to take part in the program?
It goes to every eligible voter, and whether you want to financially support a candidate with your democracy dollars, Jason, is up to you. But in Seattle, which has a population a little smaller than St. Louis County, they had about 50,000 people in the most recent election we studied use democracy dollars, which is a huge increase over the number of people who were using it before, and is a much more diverse cross-section of residents.
Would there be any restrictions on what candidates could spend their money on? Because in Missouri, you can spend your campaign money on a lot of things as long as there's a nexus between your official duties. You can spend campaign funds to pay for a meal while meeting with a lobbyist or constituent. And there's also, you could use campaign funds to hold an event at Busch Stadium or an arcade or a circus. There's really not a lot of restrictions on how money can be spent. Would you have to self-restrict yourself? in order to be part of this program?
Fantastic question. And this gets to one of your previous questions, too, about big outside PACs. What we found was overwhelming support from the people of St. Louis, 91% who rated on a 1 to 5 basis, who wanted to create an independent ethics commission to oversee the program, investigate ethics violations, ensure the program is being administered properly, and have it be independent and not subject to an existing politician in the system who might have an incentive to mess with it. So they might be able to regulate that type of thing. Of course, laws can also be passed to regulate expenditures. And it should be mentioned, we explored that issue of these quote-unquote independent PACs that every big politician and their mother has these days. Mm-hmm. And one loophole that can be closed is Missouri law allows, and St. Louis County law allows these politicians to directly coordinate fundraising with those independent PACs. I can go to you, Jason, and say, donate $1 million to the Benjamin PAC. I won't have anything to do with how it spends its money, but my best friend is running it, so donate there. The St. Louis County can pass a law, and it can be included in the law creating this, that would stop that really improper level of coordination.
Anita, you probably have followed the Missouri Ethics Commission for a while. I mean, there aren't many people that do, but it's often had issues like with compliance in Missouri's cornucopia of ethics laws. What do you think would need to be done to make sure a St. Louis County version is actually effective at making sure people follow the rules?
Yeah, if it done right, a St. Louis County version could be more effective than the Missouri Ethics Commission is. You know, we've had lots of issues with not having a quorum to even pursue investigations on the Ethics Commission, and other issues where, you know, they come to a stalemate or have sort of toothless power in some circumstances. So I think strengthening that in St. Louis County could be helpful.
Now, let's talk about cost. I think I saw in the report it would be about $3 million, and there's a number of taxes that could be used. Could either of you talk about the cost and how it would be paid for?
Sure. Similar to other places, it would be the smallest revenue stream really ever created. What we find is at every level of government where we've explored the idea of this program, it costs about 0.005 of any level of government's budget, about 0.5%. So the way we look at it is, out of every $2,000 our government spends, should we spend $1 making sure it's being spent in a way that is ethical and accountable to the people of St. Louis and Missouri to ensure that $1,999 is being spent properly? And yeah, we can look at available revenues that exist now, like a tax on internet purchases from out of state, which is something that hasn't succeeded in passing before. We can also look at new sources of revenue, like a tax on cyber cabs, autonomous taxis, which are probably going to become a huge industry soon, and right now isn't an organized interest group that could oppose such a change in St. Louis County.
Or just confiscate everybody's crypto. That could probably pay for most of the county budget. But
we are not endorsing theft.
I am not either, although I think it's pretty obvious of my feelings about crypto. But St. Louis County has had structural budget problems for a while. And given that the county's general fund will likely run out of money without big cuts in the next couple of years, I could see people not really wanting any money toward this program when they're staring at cuts to the transportation department and the health department. I would like both of you to address that point, because I could imagine it would be brought up if this is put on the ballot.
It seems to me that the funding would be the biggest challenge in getting approval. I think overall the concept is very popular. And what we see is that in St. Louis County, over the time we looked at, there were fewer than 1,500 small dollar donations made in that 10-year time span. So that's a very tiny proportion of the population that's contributing. So I think overcoming that, the funding of it is the biggest issue, but I think otherwise it would be very popular.
And in the last 30 seconds, is there any plans to get signatures for this and to try to get this on the ballot?
We hope so. Our North County-led coalition really thinks this is critical to racial and economic equity. And we've heard Republicans, including on county council, say, I would fund this because it's going to save 10 times its amount in the corrupt expenditures coming out of county government. So there's definitely an appetite, and we hope to move it forward.
Show Me Integrity's Benjamin Singer and UMSL professor Anita Mannion both worked on the Honest Elections report, which proposes instituting public financing for St. Louis County elections. Thank you both for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
The Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air is produced by Jason Rosenbaum, Alex Hoyer, Emily Woodbury, Danny Wysentowski, Maya Norfleet, and Elaine Cha. Audio engineering and sound design by Aaron Dorr. The politics editor is Fred Ehrlich, and our production intern is Roche Hemmings.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.